But we went on this one particular, actually completely crazy mission, in my view, which was to go and try and take out a Soviet post in central Kandahar. And the Russians had sort of rings of defense around Kandahar. At that point, they were already withdrawing, so it wasn't as so many forces as there had been. So we go off in the middle of the night with these guys, and they fire at this post, and then we all run. And of course, like, all hell broke loose, and then they're all firing at us, and they had tanks and all sorts of things. So we jump in these ditches, and we couldn't leave them because if we came out, they had tanks there. So we were stuck really a long time.
This is The Storytellers, where each week we speak to long-standing journalists at The Times and The Sunday Times and ask them to choose 3 stories that have defined their career. And I'm really pleased to say this week we're joined by The Sunday Times Chief Foreign Correspondent Christina Lamb. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
We'll go straight into your first story. And this is the story that made you. And it relates to your first assignment as a foreign correspondent. You were sent to Afghanistan in 1988. Tell us why and what happened.
Sure. I wasn't really sent. I sent myself. I was freelancing, and it all came about as a result of a wedding, because I was actually working as an intern for the Financial Times in the summer. And I just left university, and one day I was invited. Well, I wasn't invited. The foreign editor was invited to a lunch of South Asian politicians. Last minute, he couldn't go. So he said to me, "Why don't you go? You're always talking about India." So I went to this lunch, sat next to somebody who was the Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party. And he asked me if I'd like to interview Benanzir Bhutto. Of course, I said yes. She was living in exile in London at that time. So he arranged me to do the interview. And the day I went to see her, she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So her flat in the Barbican was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers. I'd never seen so many. And so we did the interview. She, at that time, Pakistan was a dictatorship. She couldn't be written about in the Pakistani news media. So she was very reliant on foreign press coverage. And so she was sort of very charming. Anyway, I wrote this interview. I then got a job in TV, actually, in Central TV in Birmingham, but I didn't really want to work in television. And one day, been there a few months as the most junior person in the newsroom, mostly doing the most awful job in journalism, which is the door knock after somebody's son or daughter has been killed, death knock, and going and having to ask for pictures of them. It's different, doesn't really happen these days because of social media. And so I didn't really love that job. But one day I come home from work, and there on my doormat is an invitation to a wedding. And it was Benanzir Bhutto's wedding in Pakistan, which I had never been to. And so I went to this wedding, fell in love with Pakistan, and decided that I was going to leave my job in Birmingham and go live in Pakistan. And so I went to talk to foreign editors about freelancing. Nobody was interested. They all said Pakistan's been under General Zia, the dictator, for 11 and a half years. Nothing's going to change. But several of them said we are interested in Afghanistan, which at that time was under Soviet occupation. So I said, okay, I'll go and cover Afghanistan, as one does when you're 21, 22. And so I went to live in Peshawar on the border near Afghanistan, and started travelling in and out of Afghanistan with the Mujahideen who were fighting the Russians, and absolutely fell in love with Afghanistan. And it's really been part of my life ever since.
You tell us about a particular time involving mud crabs in Kandahar. So this is in September 1988. So just take us to that point. And I presume is this the first time that you're in any danger on an assignment?
I'd been by then in and out of Afghanistan. Okay. So I was basically going, it was one of those weird things. When you were in Peshawar, you spent all your time trying to go what we called going inside. So going with the Afghan Mujahideen fighting the Russians. once you were inside, it was really pretty grim because, I mean, you were in a war, but it was very different, for example, to Ukraine or anything like that. You were basically mostly in all these mountains with these Afghan fighters who lived on absolutely nothing. I mean, they lived on stale bread. And so there was nothing to eat. There were mines everywhere. So you're constantly walking through minefields. There were Soviet planes, warplanes and MiGs and helicopters. And so, it was pretty dangerous, but I don't really remember thinking that much about that. But it was also quite difficult conditions and quite unusual being a woman with them. Mostly they didn't quite know what to make of me. And so this particular story, I went to Kandahar. So mostly I was going to places nearer Peshawar, like Jalalabad and Paktia. But Kandahar is in the west of Afghanistan, the southwest. And that trip was very interesting to me because of two things. First of all, who I went with, which was Hamid Karzai, who at that point was completely unknown really outside of Afghanistan, and he was spokesperson for one of there was basically 7 different groups fighting in the war, and he was spokesperson for the smallest group, and we had become good friends in Peshawar. So he never used to go into the war. He used to be sort of talking about it outside, but he decided that he, really, I guess, needed some credibility of actually going in. He is from Kandahar, so he wanted to go to that area. And he also wanted to go with a particular group who were known as the Mullahs Front. And this is why this story is interesting. And they went round on motorbikes. So we joined up with them near Quetta in Pakistan, and then travelled across the border and travelled around with them for 3 weeks on the backs of their motorbikes. Now these, we were going into places that were under Soviet occupation. We were constantly being bombed. Hamid Karzai was on a hit list for the Russians, and he drove me mad because actually everywhere we stopped, he would immediately radio like local tribal chiefs and elders and say, like, hey, I'm there. This, of course, is long before mobile phones. And so people would then come. And then almost immediately after he'd radioed, people would get bombed by the Russians. After a while, I was like, do you think maybe it's not such a good idea being radioing people everywhere we go? So we constantly seem to be taking cover in orchards. I mean, it's an area, it's where all the grapes and things are grown in Afghanistan. So we seem to spend a lot of time in ditches. But we went on this one particular, actually completely crazy mission, in my view, which was to go and try and take out a Soviet post in central Kandahar. And the Russians had sort of rings of defense around Kandahar. At that point, they were already withdrawing, so it wasn't as so many forces as there had been. So we go off in the middle of the night with these guys, and they fire at this post, and then we all run. And of course, like, all hell broke loose, and then they're all firing at us, and they had tanks and all sorts of things. So we jump in these ditches, and we couldn't leave them because if we came out, they had tanks there. So we were stuck really a long time. So over a night, a day, it was very hot and there was nothing to eat. And every time we kind of like looked at trying to get out of these trenches or ditches, really, we could see the Russian tanks, so we couldn't leave. And in fact, they fired, some of the men that I was with were in a sort of grape drying thing behind, which was quite high, and they fired at that and killed some of the fighters. So we were just completely stuck in this place. But there was some kind of like muddy puddles and with crabs in. So one of the Mujahideen we were with, Ratman, a big guy, he like held out these crabs and like, great, we found these, and they started eating them and they gave to me, and I was like, no, I'm not eating that. But I did drink the water because there was nothing else and it was really hot, and I thought I'm just going to die of not drinking. So we were there. It felt like forever. I guess it was a day and a night. And then eventually the tanks moved away and we could run out and ran into these trees. And the first thing I saw was a little boy eating a watermelon. And I have never wanted anything more in my life than that watermelon. And so I said to Ratmullah, I really like that watermelon. And he took it. And now I feel really horrible that I did this.
That poor Afghan boy was denied.
He had to be fair. I mean, he gave me a bit of it, wasn't it?
And it sounds like you needed it.
And it tasted like the best thing I ever ate. Still, I remember the taste of that. And so, yeah, it meant that years later when the Taliban took over, these were the people I had travelled with. Mullah Mohammed, who was the head of Al Mullah's Front, became the deputy leader of the Taliban to Mullah Omar. So I always thought it was a little bit odd at the beginning when there was all this stuff that they don't accept women, because they'd actually spent 3 weeks with a Western woman living with them and on a motorbike, and they seemed fine about it at the time. So it meant years later when 9/11 happened. So that story made me in a way in that I won Young Journalist of the Year. So actually, because in those days you didn't have internet or anything, I didn't really have any sense of anybody reading my work, because it just was like I was sending things into a black hole, and I didn't really know how they appeared. I'd get occasionally nice messages from my editor, but
you don't get a comment section
I didn't
those days,
see
do you?
what other people were writing So then suddenly the FT contacted me and said that I'd won this award. So that was amazing, because I didn't know anything about it, didn't know they'd entered me or anything. And then also years later when 9/11 happened and suddenly everybody's interested in the Taliban and then in Hamid Karzai, he was my friend. I knew him, and I also knew some of the Taliban. So it meant I was in a very good position to cover Afghanistan then.
How do you approach that as a journalist then? You've got, these people have in part protected you in your previous, prior years, and yet they're capable of committing atrocities. How do you approach that as a journalist? You call them your friends, but at the same time, they're committing heinous crimes.
So, I mean, because I was sort of living the story, I was living in Peshawar and travelling back and forth. And so, I got to know lots of the Afghan fighters very well. Hamid Karzai was really my best friend when I lived there, but we fell out because when the Taliban became a thing and then started moving into Afghanistan, and in the 90s, so it was maybe 8 years or so after this trip, and were doing all the things that we now know that they do and the way that they treated women. I was horrified. So I met up with Hamid Karzai and we had a huge fight because he was working at that time which he later sort of tried to forget, but that he was their spokesperson and representing them at the UN and at that time. So I couldn't believe that this person I got to know, who was very well read, very educated, read lots of Western literature that he loved, as well as lots of Persian literature. And I couldn't believe that he was working with them. So we had a huge fight. We didn't speak actually for some years after that.
Let's move on to your second story. And this is the story that nearly broke you. And let's pick up on Benazir Bhutto, former Prime Minister of Pakistan. And this is an assassination attempt on her life in 2007. This is just after she'd gone back to Pakistan after being in exile, hadn't she? For 8 years or so, she'd been away. How would you describe your relationship with her, for starters?
So when I first lived in Pakistan, obviously, as I told you, I went there because of her. I mean, she actually changed my life. And when I look back and think, why did she invite me to that wedding? I'll never know now because she died. But so it was because of her that I had gone to live in Pakistan. I lived in Pakistan from 88 to 90, and after I'd been there some time, it was mostly covering Afghanistan at the beginning, but then there was this mysterious air crash in which General Zia, the military dictator, was killed. And then there were elections, and Benazir won those elections. So she became prime minister, the first woman prime minister of an Islamic country. I think she was only 34. She was very young to be prime minister. She'd just become a mother. And when she became prime minister, there was huge excitement because it had been a dictatorship for so long, and people thought, this was going to change everything. And as is often the way with these things, actually it was quite disappointing because she didn't make the changes that people had expected, partly because she, as she always said, she was in office, not in power. And so she was not really in control of a lot of things. The Pakistan military, which is really the big power always in Pakistan, stayed in charge of Afghan policy, of foreign policy, of nuclear policy. So she didn't do the things that she perhaps people thought, and she didn't make the differences to women that I thought that she would do. So I would argue with her actually as well, why aren't you, or there's all this expectation. And I had a particular thing I was really upset about because I'd done a story. There was something called a Hudud ordinance in Pakistan, under which if a woman or a young girl was raped, she had to produce 4 male witnesses to the penetration. If she couldn't produce that, and that's impossible, right? If she couldn't produce that, she would be jailed for sex outside marriage. So the jails in Pakistan were full of young girls and women who had been raped, and yet they were in jail. I couldn't believe it. So I was interviewing these women and then was really shocked about that. So I thought Benazir would do something about that. And she didn't, and she said she couldn't because she couldn't take on a religious lobby, and she didn't have the power. So, it was very mixed. And so we had a sort of, relationship of ups and downs where we fell out. She didn't like the fact I wrote a lot about her husband and the corruption that there was that brought down her government. And I think she literally said to me, we thought you were with us, and it was this, you're either with us or you're against us. And I'm a journalist, I'm reporting on what's happening. So we did fall out, but then we, when she was in exile and she was in London, we used to meet, and in fact she sent a gift to me at my wedding, and as a sort of peace offering, I think. And then when she went back to Pakistan in 2007, after years of exile, she said to me, you must come with us. And so I said yes, absolutely, and was excited about going back with her. But just before she went, she had a press conference here in London, and she mentioned the fact that she'd had all these assassination threats, and I spoke to her about it afterwards, and she'd had all these threats. And so I was thinking, I'm not sure it's such a good idea actually being on this bus with her when she goes back. She planned to fly to Karachi, and then she was going to go on an open-top bus through the streets to then give a speech at the Memorial of Jinnah. I just, in those previous 6 months or a year, I'd had several narrow escapes. I'd been ambushed by the Taliban in Helmand, and I'm really lucky to escape with my life. I was also in a hotel that was blown up in a suicide bombing. So I started to feel like my luck was running out. I think foreign correspondents are often very superstitious.
Are you superstitious?
Yeah, a bit. So, and I always thought I was lucky correspondent. I always was in the right place at the right time. I mean, sometimes you could say I was in the wrong place at the right time because bad things happened. I'd go on holiday and things would be blown up, and I would be there, you know. And everywhere I went, the head of state seemed to sort of be assassinated, or even I was in Brazil and the head of state was impeached. And so all these things kept happening. And so I started to think, actually, is it a good idea going on her bus? Because she's the biggest target probably in the world at that moment. Pakistan had more terrorist attacks than any other country on earth. She was a woman, sort of standing for liberal democracy, all the things that they hated. I knew that the military didn't want her back. President Musharraf, the general who she'd done a deal with to be allowed back, I didn't believe he wanted her back because he told me years before, she's never coming back as long as I'm here. So I couldn't really see how this was going to work out well. And so when we were on the plane to Karachi, I said to her, I'm not going to come on your bus. I'm going to come on the bus behind with the media. So when we arrived, I sort of stayed back. But then I saw her bus going, and like her on top with some of her political colleagues, and all the excitement and all the crowds in the street, and I just had to be there. So
you made an emotional decision, didn't you?
Ran after that bus, didn't get on the media bus, ran after that bus, and I knew that some of the people on top, and I said, and so they brought me up on top of the bus. They allowed a few journalists to come and do quick interviews like TV and go, but I was the only journalist that actually was on the bus the whole time. And of course, eventually the bus was blown up and I was on that bus.
Describe that moment. I read you writing about it. You said a huge wall of orange flame came over the bus. There were in fact two blasts.
Yeah. So what happened was, I mean, we'd been on that bus for hours. Like, I think we left the airport about 2 p.m, and there were so many people in the streets. It wasn't even moving at walking pace. And actually it was scary because there were people everywhere on rooftops. We were going under bridges and flyovers. And I said to her head of security, how can you protect her? But, you know, it could easily be people with guns and things on. And he just said, it's in God's hands, which I didn't find very reassuring. So I was kind of at the beginning thinking, this is mad. But then after a while, you forget about it because, you know, just, you know, the excitement of being there, seeing her so excited to be back and among the people. There was maybe about 15 of us on top of the bus. So the other people, mostly I knew there were people who'd been with her politically, but also because she kind of attracted strange hangers-on. There was also a woman that she used to read self-help books with in Dubai, and it really was quite unclear what she was doing there. And so we were driving, and, you know, night fell, and we ordered pizzas onto the bus. And, you know, it was just going on, and really a normal thing to do. I should have left the bus because journalistically I had everything.
You'd already got everything you needed, yeah.
Slightly there was an issue. I did think about it a couple of times, but then I didn't really know how to leave because I was on the bus. My stuff was at the airport. I hadn't really anything with me. And anyway, so I stayed on it. And then, of course, eventually what happened, and it was sinister because the lights kept going out in front of us, the street lights. And Benanzir actually called me to the front and said, have you noticed that this is happening? And I knew from having years of going to Pakistan that often the street lights would go out and then these sort of men on motorbikes would appear with guns and shoot people and then disappear. So I didn't like that. And the other thing was that there was supposed to be jammers to stop any kind of suicide bombing signals, you know, being sent off by remote control, and the jammers weren't working. And so, because we could all use our mobile phones. So anyway, it got to about 11 in the evening, and she'd gone downstairs to practice her speech that she was going to be giving when we finally arrived. And then all of a sudden there was this sound, and the bus sort of swayed, and it was not a loud sound. The first sound, I knew it was an explosion, but it wasn't a big explosion. But I also knew, because I unfortunately had seen and covered suicide bombings repeatedly at that point in different places, that often what happens is there's a small explosion, everybody stops and like looks, and then there's a much bigger explosion, because then you've got everyone gathered together. And sure enough, so we all sort of were thrown on the ground on the roof of the bus as this happened. And then everybody started to get up, and I just remember that, and I shouted at people, "Don't get up!" But almost before I could say anything, there was a massive explosion. And I just remember, because there was a load of noise before, the noise of the people, there was sort of music, and suddenly everything stopped, and it was like silence, and then you could hear like sort of screams, and then sirens, and then everything seems to be on fire around us. And I realised pretty quickly that I wasn't hurt. I'd been thrown to the floor, but I was okay. But I thought, I'm on top of a double-decker bus, and everything's on fire around me, and the fuel tank will catch fire. So I was thinking, I've got to get off this bus immediately. So I was screaming at people, "Get off the bus." And it's funny that sort of like jumping off the top of a double-decker bus doesn't seem such a big deal when something like that's happening. So we were all trying to get off, but I mean, 3 people had been killed on top of the bus. There was 15. The bomb was on one side, and it was the biggest bomb there had ever been in Pakistan. 150 people were killed. But terribly, sadly, the bus had like a kind of chain, a human chain around it of young people. They called themselves martyrs for Benazir. I mean, students, young people, and they took the brunt of that explosion. And on the bus, as I said, a few people were killed. Some people were, I was sort of in the middle. I wasn't on the side where it was hit. So I got out and started running, and somebody grabbed me quite quickly and said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "Yeah, fine." And then I realized it was covered in blood, but it was blood from somebody that was like killed on the bus.
Yeah. What does that experience do to you psychologically? What is the psychological effect? Obviously, you know, maybe not in that moment, of course, because all you're thinking about is phoning your family, you know, making sure that you're safe and trying to take in what's just happened to you. But when you reflect on that now,
well, in a strange way, you know, it wasn't frightening at the time because it all happened quickly. It was much more frightening, for example, being in an ambush in Helmand, where for hours we were running and people were firing at, because then you have lots of time thinking, I'm never going to get out of this. But the bus happened, and then I was okay. But I was, you know, clear quite that a lot of people had been killed, and I didn't know at the beginning if Benazir was all right. But when I came back from that, I mean, first of all, we went to Benazir's house. I don't think you have time for me to go into a long story, but the next morning, so then I went to my hotel. And the next morning I woke up, and I mean, my pillow, my hair was full of basically bits of burnt flesh of other people. I mean, that's really horrific. And and when I got back to the UK, it was hard because, as I said to you, it was one of a number of things that had happened to me in a short period of time. And oddly enough, the night, and I'm a mother, so, you know, my son then was 6 or 7. And I knew one of the awful things about that was we tend to watch Channel 4 News at home. And so I knew that my husband and son would have the TV on. And I had called earlier saying, "Hey, Mummy's on the bus." And the explosion happened just after 11. So it was just after 7 UK time. So I knew that they would be watching on TV, and there would probably be a news report that this bus had been blown up, and they knew I was on it. So I was also very desperate to find them. Of course, we'd been on this bus for hours, and before that, flying from Dubai, all our phones were dead. This was before the days where you had sort of things to charge your phone. And so I was desperate to find somewhere to call and be able to call them. And anyway, so when I came back, I kind of thought, I don't want to put my family through this, as well as thinking that maybe I'm not lucky anymore. And the night that I came back, I was going for a dinner that the International Bar Association had organised, which was in honour of a Zimbabwean human rights lawyer called Beatrice Mtetwa, who's also a friend, who I greatly admire, a very brave woman. And Zimbabwe is also one of the countries that I've covered for years and feel quite depressed about. And so we had this dinner, and I told them I'd just come back. It was within days of that happening. And I said to her, Beatrice, I'm thinking about stopping doing this because, it's too dangerous. And also I said, I'm not sure it makes any difference. And I said to Zimbabwe, I keep coming there. At the time, we were banned as journalists, and I was particularly named as an enemy of the state. And I said, I take a risk coming into the country, but I'm putting other people at risk. Everybody that I speak to is taking a risk, and I can fly away at the end, and they can't. And I said, it doesn't make any difference. I write these stories about all the terrible things, people being beaten by the Mugabe, about the poverty that they're living under because it's run like a mafia state, about the rapes of women, and nothing changes. I write these stories. I pour my heart into writing these stories. I really try and make people back home care about what's happening. And nothing changes. And actually, Zimbabwe's just ironically 2 weeks ago had yet another rigged election. The same thing's still happening. But Beatrice said to me, she said, you know what? She said, if people like you stop doing what you're doing, what's the point of what people like me are doing? We need people like you to report on what we're doing. And yeah, maybe it doesn't seem like it's making a difference, but maybe it will make a difference one day. And if it doesn't, at least we tried to do something and we documented it. So she said, please don't give up. And it really made me think. And I was reading with my son a story at the time, a Dr. Seuss story, the Lorax, and I don't remember the exact words now in that, but it had words that was basically, the same thing, that it's important that people care.
So that nearly called time on your career, but fortunately for those of us that enjoy reading you and that value what you do, you didn't, and we've got just sadly a few minutes for your final one. No, it's fine. The story that stayed with you, and it does link into what you're really saying about going and reporting and pouring your heart into it, and it feeling like it doesn't make a difference. Now, when we talk about what's happened in Afghanistan with the Taliban, and then them being out of power, and then the stepping back of US, Western, UK forces, and the Taliban then taking over again, 20 years after they'd been ousted from power. You'd been going backwards and forwards to Taliban over 3 decades, and you went back, I know, just as they were in the process of taking over the country. That story, it's obvious why it stays with you. But what are your main emotions on it, if we're to sum it up within a few minutes, having watched a country go through so much transition to almost get back to where you started with it? How does that feel
I
for
could
you as a
sum it up in
reporter?
one word. It's heartbreaking. as I said, I'm passionate about Afghanistan. It's very much part of my life. I've gone back and forth. I have a lot of friends there. And to see the Taliban take power again after 20 years of NATO presence, of all the money that was poured in, all the effort, all the lives that were lost, NATO lives, British 474 soldiers were killed, lots of people were really badly wounded, but also thousands of Afghans. For what? I mean, just for the Taliban to come back and do exactly the same as they did before. And here we are in 2023 with a country where girls cannot go to high school, they cannot go to university. Girls finish primary school in Afghanistan in tears. Lots of girls around the world finish primary school in tears because they think they're not going to see their friends again. But in Afghanistan, they're not going to school again. They're going to be condemned to a life of imprisonment at home. Women can't work, women can't go to gyms, they just stopped women going to national parks. I mean, for what? Women can't go, they closed beauty salons, which was the last thing that women could still operate and do. I feel shame as a woman, I feel shame as a journalist, I feel shame as a mother that we have this situation. And everybody's kind of sitting by. It's 2 years now since the Taliban took over. At the beginning, everybody said, this is outrageous, we can't have this. But what are they doing? It's still the situation. I get messages almost every day from Afghan women and girls, desperate. They just feel like, women are committing suicide because they feel they have no life. And honestly, I don't know what to say to them. One of my friends there, right at the beginning when the Taliban took over, said to me, should I wish that you and the West had never come because you created dreams and you've shattered them. And that's so sad. And so I spend...
Do you think that that's right? I mean, it seems quite a harsh...
No, I think, I'd like to think not, because I'd like to think that, it did make a difference, that the fact that millions of girls went to school.
And the fact that they've tasted freedom surely means that they now have a point of reference and, something to want to go back to, although it's, very, very
but
clearly
out of point, right? I mean, if you know that you thought you could do these things, you thought you could become a journalist or a film director or a police woman or, anything, a banker, and then all of a sudden you're basically told, no, you can't do anything. And I understand more restrictions are going to come in soon as well. So I've sort of now, I spend a lot of my free time, and I'm going from here to do exactly the same, speak at events about Afghanistan, now I'm going to go and talk to some politicians in Parliament about, it's not right that we don't do anything. And
have we let the women, especially of Afghanistan, down?
Yeah, I feel like that. And I feel, the hardest thing in my job, people often ask, how can you go to these places and risk your life, etc. That's not the hard thing in my job. The hard thing in my job is when you do all these things, you write these stories, and then people ask you, I told you my story, and what difference did it make? And I find that an impossible question to answer. I write a lot about, we haven't talked about this, but about rape and war. And I think, the world should feel ashamed that we don't bring people to justice, that this is happening so much, and we, apparently let it happen. And I feel the same about Afghan women. We, a lot of people at the beginning, after 9/11, when Western forces went into Afghanistan, people made a big deal. Tony Blair, was then Prime Minister, his wife, made a radio program about Afghan women. We were told that one of the reasons for going into Afghanistan was because of the way the Taliban treated Afghan women. But they're treating them the same way now. Where is that international community? Do we no longer get outraged? I do feel, doing this job for a long time, 35 years, we're very bad at ending wars, we as in the international community make the same mistakes over and over again, and it seems like if bad people hang around long enough, then we just kind of give up. So Assad, for example, in Syria, which I've covered, is still there. Picture of my colleague Marie Colvin, who was killed by his forces. In the end, we seem to just be accepting him, and that's not a good message. I don't want to end on a message like that, because I also see in all of these places people doing amazing things, including some Afghan women that have stayed, that are still trying to do underground education.
That is why I'm sure the reporting will continue, and also raising awareness beyond that as well. It's been such a fascinating conversation, so well rounded. We've covered such a lot. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Christina Lamb. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.